Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first research conference of the new academic year. Thank you for joining us. One quick announcement before we introduce Dr. Krucoff. The CME rules have been a little clarified to our program, and we just wanted to let everyone know that might be watching from afar or in the room that to receive credit, please text your code today. It'll end after today. So just to let you know in case you used to send it later than the day of the conference. So it's a real pleasure to kick off the year today with Dr. Mitch Krucoff presenting. About a year and a half ago, he shared with us some wonderful work that he was doing with the FDA in a private collaboration that described essentially a number of innovations in monitoring medical devices through the MedEpiNet, the Medical Device Epidemiology Network. And today we have the real privilege of hearing about the advances from that time. So now his group will share with us some of the advances that now lay the foundation for a national medical device registry that provides a number of opportunities, not only for patients and companies, but also investigators and scientists to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. Dr. Krucoff is well known to the audience. He's a professor of medicine, senior staff interventional cardiac cath lab, the founder and director of the ECG core lab here at the DCRI, director of the cardiovascular devices unit, and for his efforts in these long-standing collaborations with the FDA, has been recognized with a Distinguished Service Award. He's the director of two programs that we have in collaboration with the FDA, the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium, as well as MedEpiNet. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Krucoff.
Well, thanks so much, Uptal, and to everybody's hope for relief. I'm not going to go back a year and a half and start all over because there's a lot going forward, and what I hope to do is actually finish early and then drag some of the many co-conspirators who have been involved over the years that we've been doing this work here at the DCRI, who have helped inspire it and, importantly, helped get things done. And if I left anybody off this list, which is likely, knowing me, that I apologize ahead of time, but this is a very special group. So I'm going to focus mostly on the recommendations which came out August 24th of the Medical Device Registry's Task Force, but a little bit of background just because in medical devices, we have been very much caught up in what is now more than a decade of appreciating that in the United States, the cost of research and development and actually bringing a new therapy to the bedside has progressively escalated, while the actual number of new molecular entities or new medical devices that are reaching the bedside has been dropping. And that's not the pattern that we're seeing in the rest of the world, particularly in medical devices. The device lag between heart valves and percutaneous valves and other medical devices being at a bedside in Europe and the United States has approached 3 to 5 years of delay and almost twice the cost. So compounding this over this same time frame has been a very unfriendly economy, and whether you're a manufacturer trying to create revenue and build a business, or whether you're an FDA director trying to run a federal agency, it's all been bad in terms of the financial availability of dollars to grow what you're trying to do. And that led to, in fact, a whole 8-year period of medical device companies such as biosensors saying, I'm just not going to come to the United States. I'll bring my products everywhere else. And to fast forward a little bit, I'll just point out that this company, Biosensors, which was such a headline in broadcasting their reach to the entire rest of the world, is in fact going to perform its first pivotal product, bringing Biolimus A9 to American citizens and bedsides in a study that we will coordinate here at the DCRI. The backside of this has been that even while companies have been complaining that the big bad FDA is the principal barrier to bringing new devices into the American theater, other academic organizations such as Rita Redberg's group have criticized the agency for being too loose and too easy. So if you're at the FDA, it's pretty sort of in the middle of the conversation, fundamental scapegoat kind of mentality. Despite that, from the Commissioner's Office in 2004 to the Center for Devices in 2008 to the present, the shift in emphasis from protecting the public health to promoting the public health a much more active principle to get engaged, to change the landscape, has to me been one of the most exciting things about working with the agency as a partner, particularly from this organization as an academic research organization and as an interventional cardiologist. So what does all this really center around? It really centers around learning to speak the same language and using the lack of dollars to recognize that what we used to just throw money at was a very redundant and in fact erosive kind of information system, and emphasizing the degree to which efficiency and using structured data elements, structured data definitions, and speaking the same language actually gives us better information about device safety, about benefit risk performance, and it also saves time and money. And it's the traction of that conversation that maybe you could ironically say all of the terrible economy globally has been the only way that we would have ever gotten to this conversation. Our first toe in the water of structured data was the Academic Research Consortium. This was a very informal group of academic research organizations and FDA who just recognized that for medical devices, it would be nice if we all used the same definitions for certain key, particularly rare catastrophic safety endpoints like stent thrombosis. And the definition that Don Cutlip and the Academic Research Consortium forwarded in circulation in 2007 has been followed by definitions for transaortic valve implantation, for bleeding complications, updates as transaortic valves is a very fast-moving area, and now in percutaneous mitral valves, and you will see more ARC definitions coming forward because the value of structured data can be seen just from stent thrombosis. Since Don's publication in 2007, there are more than 500 clinical observation and clinical trials publications on more than a dozen different drug-eluting stent platforms that all use the same definition for stent thrombosis, promoting poolable data and meta-analysis that's much more informative than if every study used a different definition. So structured data, along with the recognition that if we learn to speak each other's language and learn to recognize that medical device innovation is not one game or another, but is an ecosystem, that in aligning our efforts, a lot of the things we're all trying to do, everybody wants safer, better devices to be used on your mom or your dad, or for some of us on myself when I get there, because I'm getting there. So along those lines, recognizing that if we align our intentions and then look at our processes, the redundancy of the processes also facilitates alignment that is quite efficient. And as you get into who are the stakeholders in the ecosystem of medical devices, each one really behaves as if they have their own game board to play on. And a lot of the work that we have done over the past decade has just been in recognizing that we have to change that conversation and recognize that we're all playing the same game. We just have different degrees of vested interest depending on whether I'm a patient who wants to know about the device that was implanted in my body, or whether I'm a manufacturer who wants to figure out how to make more money by building a better, safer device, or whether I'm a regulator who has to approve these things, et cetera. Again, we're all in the same end game of we want better, safer devices at the bedside for clinical use and a better way of understanding how they behave and in whom. So that was the story a year and a half ago as we launched the MD EpiNet public-private partnership. The grant award was based on a grant proposal that chartered an activity with 3 academic centers at Harvard, Cornell, and Duke here as the coordinating center to develop and maintain in a public-private partnership environment national and international scientific infrastructure and methodologic approaches to overcome and eliminate discontinuities in evaluation and surveillance that currently exist within the total product life cycle. And that went very well with Jeff Shuren's 2014-15 strategic priorities, 2 of the main 3 being to strengthen the clinical trial enterprise, as well as to work on a better balance between how much pre-market information should prevent or be required before a device can reach the bedside, compared to how much post-market information we could continue to systematically collect in structured ways. So in the same time frame that we started the MD EpiNet, there was a call from the CDRH for a medical device registry task force. And that task force was largely constituted in post-market thinking of how do we get better information using registries for devices that have already been approved. And on June 24th of 2014, both the Medical Device Registry Task Force under MD EpiNet and a planning board under the Brookings Institute were launched in parallel to look at sort of a high-level view and a more nuts and bolts view of a sustainable national medical device system. And the FDA rolled this system concept out as something that would support better regulatory decisions and serve stakeholders across the medical device innovation ecosystem. So a system that would do something more than just make regulatory decisions. The Brookings Institute Planning Board recommendations came out last February, and the draft of the task force, which is out for public comment right now, was rolled into public view August 24th with a concomitant publication in JAMA expressing an overview and invitation to comment. So one of the things the task force instantly appreciated is that when we're talking not just about cardiovascular devices, but all devices, and not just about regulators or manufacturers or physicians, but about all stakeholders, we have an incredible range of diversity to incorporate. And all of that is essentially listed here. Out of all of this diversity, the one and only singular principle is that the only constant is progressively accelerated change. So in every one of these theaters, from every one of these perspectives, whether it's cost drivers or informatics or the actual technologies being implemented in medical devices themselves, this is all changing as fast as your iPhone or anything else in the modern world. And managing that with a national system became part of the challenge. At the same time, there was no question that one vision the task force could share for the device ecosystem was that working together across stakeholders, we can accrue and disseminate knowledge of device benefit, risk, and safety faster and less expensively than the way we do it today. So that was kind of where we started last June. Out of the task force recommendations, and you're welcome to read all 130 pages if you want, but I'm going to just touch on some of the highlights before we open the discussion. I think one of the most important was to just recognize analytically what does the functional objective of this national system need to be. And there, the mechanisms of shifting health information infrastructure to refocus analytic methodologies for this group, I'm really, I think, preaching to the choir. So from a device language point of view, we can see this as transforming heterogeneity into dimensionality. And what do we really mean by that? Well, currently, we deal with a lot of idiosyncratic heterogeneity. So largely, when we have a concern like our stents hand grenades in human hearts, we reach out to a disparate range of data sources that generally have different data quality. They frequently have different data elements and equally frequently use different definitions, even though the elements are called the same. And in putting all that together, what it means is that a lot of the computational effort we put into analytic methodologies is first and foremost just to sort out the signal from the noise. Is this a real signal or is it not? And insofar as we reach into the pre-market, we may use other mechanisms to try and deal with the confounding variables and disparate noise. We may build standalone randomized clinical trials where the inclusion and exclusion criteria define a discrete population, a population of intended use for devices. This type of build it every single time we need it is expensive and it's slow to do randomized trials for every new iteration of every new device. And then when we release the device with approval into the post-market where we start using it on everybody who suffers from the disease, we have the classic pre versus post-market gap that opens between the approved indication for the device and the actual practice of medicine in the United States. So what would the national system model be that would look different from that? And here the emphasis is on capturing the true heterogeneity of clinical practice and making that our research database, rather than a parallel universe we call clinical research, which we have to pay for and support in separation from our clinical practice information systems. So this focus is focused on data sharing infrastructure that could be erected across existing electronic health systems. and implementing, and through that data sharing, implementing and encouraging the implementation of structured data sets where we have a focus for particular device areas on what is the core minimum data elements that we actually need to capture to evaluate the device, using common definitions, and ultimately in putting ourselves in a position to assess device-specific applications. This gives us ability to concentrate our computational power then on assignable dimensionality that relates to outcomes, like benefit risk, signal detection, and mitigation, and ultimately shifts us from building a research environment and clinical trials environment to simply tapping our clinical practice environment when we need to address particular prospective questions of evaluation. What is medical device dimensionality? Well, this is where sometimes I wish we actually had Rob still on campus, because this is what's different from drugs and biologics, that we have unique issues with a medical device. For instance, what is the specific make and model of the device can matter. The procedure, the training level and experience level of the operator can matter. This is not just taking a pill. This is putting in a hip or a coronary device. The patient characteristics, the short and long-term outcomes, the regional, national, and international variation. These are elements that all can affect device performance. But if we target a device because of a safety signal, when it's not the device, but it's the operators putting it in who need more training, then we're going after the manufacturers with the wrong question and answer in the beginning. So sorting out this dimensionality actually has a very critical role in understanding how to make safer, better devices, because sometimes it's build a better mousetrap, other times it's train your doctors a little more thoroughly. What is the support? What are the analytic implications across stakeholders? Well, more informed benefit risk certainly can help regulatory decisions without gaps. That will help manufacturers find better, faster, and less expensive research and development paths to reach the market and start generating revenue. It can support best practice guidelines for clinical care, because this is made of the same stuff. Comparative effectiveness and real cost if we're dealing with real dimensionality, and enhance patient knowledge and confidence that, in fact, I know as much as there is to know about my device, and I know whether I should pick one brand of device or another, or whether I should seek out a hospital that has more experienced operators than another. For safety signals, which traditionally, like stent thrombosis when it arose in 2006, generate panic, we tend to learn about safety signals through the media and big headlines like time bombs and hand grenades in hearts, can shift us from that type of panic, which changes the research and development environment profoundly, into incentivized targets. So with real heterogeneity and device dimensionality, we'll have a lower rate of false signals. We can promote earlier detection of real signals so fewer people come to harm. We can enhance assignation of the actual signal sources and then create an efficient and incentivized structure within the same data sharing electronic system to show that we've made the signal go away by addressing the appropriate entity, and whether that's with a better device, a new generation of device, or whether it's by better operator training or better patient selection, we can show not only that there is a real safety signal, but we can show that we've made it go away. So this is a quick picture of David Feigel's original concept of the total product life cycle, and it's important to recognize that TPLC is not about one device necessarily, but in a competitive marketplace, as soon as one device breaks through, like a new aortic valve delivered percutaneously, there are 3 or 4 other manufacturers who are working on the same gadget. We'll see iterations within each of those companies, and ultimately this is intended to be an accrual of knowledge in a device system space or pipeline. So real-world dimensionality has the ability to impact early feasibility studies, pivotal PMA studies, post-market label extensions, and safety surveillance all at the same time. And based on that, one of the key task force recommendations was to change from the planning board's National Medical Device Surveillance System nomenclature to not call this a surveillance entity, but to emphasize that this is a National Medical Device Evaluation System. What is the architecture of this system was maybe the second most important area of recommendations from the task force. and this was centered around what were called strategically coordinated registry networks. And this started with the recognition that building a de novo national system for devices was impossibly expensive. There's no way it could incorporate the diversity that we need. The perception of this big government sort of entity would be impossible to sell, and ultimately by the time it was built, it would be outdated. So we abandoned that concept pretty quickly. Of the current and emerging e-information system sources, health information sources, registries, health records, administrative data, mobile apps, etc., it was recognized that professional registries and device registries currently provide the most robust content and operational predicates. So that's why this was called a registry network, even though ultimately it involves pieces, electronic pieces, that are not registries per se. The corollary recognition was that there's no single registry that does it all, or that can do it all in terms of device evaluation. But rather than trash the registries, the notion was then, so if we take complementary registries and can data share across them, could we create something that no one registry offers us? And there, data sharing and interoperability, the ability to link these together, was what we considered best termed a coordinated registry network. And we have already seen elements of that, as have been described here, the TVT registry that ties to administrative claims data. So you have a lot of device-oriented information linked to long-term follow-up, et cetera, et cetera. There are many good examples. The pragmatic advantages and efficiencies are that this really lets us, as information technology and as more and more health information comes from Walmart and CVS, or comes from iPhones or patient-reported sources, that this is a system that can continue to emerge and evolve, even as those sources emerge and evolve. And that this involves a minimum of re-engineering. If we take already existing sustained symptoms, frequently we can leverage existing clinical workflow. So for instance, the NCDR registries already have hospitals entering data. This is already incorporated in the clinical workflow. And most of these systems have established governance and sustainability models, so we don't have to figure out how to pay for everything. We just have to make sure that if we dual purpose these existing entities, that it's done in a friendly way that enhances their values rather than as a government takeover or by adding a lot of cost and effort. So there are lots of variations on how this can be done. Again, the upper right here is a slide that we took from Matt Brennan, and Matt, I'm very happy to say, is here with us today, just showing structurally the linking of a TVT-like registry with claims data for long-term follow-up. In the middle, we may talk about later, but would be data extraction if you have a minimum core data structured set for a particular device, and there were multiple hospitals using an electronic health record that used that same data elements, as well as a national registry that used those data elements, as well as another professional registry. We could tap multiple hospitals across the registries if they all simply have the same structured data with just an interoperability solution to share those data and create much wider patient access for the real heterogeneity of American clinical practice. And distributed data networks, such as been used for safety signals and Sentinel and other safety observations. The other important thing I think to recognize about this type of coordinated registry networking is that it doesn't matter what language it's in if it's actually the same structured data internally. So the international ramifications of this is actually another MD-EpiNet sidebar that I won't go into other than to say that Jimmy Chang and many others have worked closely with a work item that Brian McCourt and I wrote, or when we started MD-EpiNet for the IMDRF, to distill globally the essential principles of informatics, registry infrastructure, and methodologies for medical device evaluation, and that should be reported later this year. Okay, finally, how do you put all this together? And I think the main message out of the task force recommendations there is that if we're creating a system of collaborative systems, we better be ready to be collaborative. That without goodwill and trust, none of this works. And even if you could convince the US Congress to throw billions of dollars at this medical system, it won't work unless we can shift what is currently a very fragmented and distrustful ecosystem where patients are about patients and Manufacturers are about manufacturers, and regulators and federal agencies are about their business, and professional doctors are about their business, and recognize that working separately, we end up undermining our ability to progress at all. And it's not the money that's going to change that. It's going to have to be a vision of really how and why we all would work in an ecosystem toward bringing better, safer medical devices to the bedside faster. And it's almost silly, because as soon as you say that, the why is self-evident. The pre-competitive focus is something we have a good deal of experience with in the CSRC and the harmonization by doing, but basically it all gets down to understanding everybody's personal stakeholder value equations. So if you're a regulator, you need decisions that can protect and promote the public health. If you're building devices and you're a business, you need an innovation, research and development that has good timelines, cost, and can get into a market where you actually generate revenue with uptake and adoption. If it's an individual patient or a family member who's a patient, you want health information, but you also want their consent to use their health information to be comfortable, and has to be an integrated part of this equation if it's no longer a clinical research data set per se, but it's actual electronic health information that's being tapped for research questions. As a clinician, you'd like to know that this is best practice and how to do it, and as a payer, you'd like to know that compared to other options, this is not only better for patients, but it's less expensive overall to your system or to the national health system if you happen to be the Center for Medicare Services. So the path forward is a focus on pilot projects. And pilot project is about the only way that I think we could recognize to take all of these high-level. Unfortunately, the planning board was stuck with the high-level stuff. And the report reads like a high-level stuff. The nitty-gritty of how would you actually do this? How would you implement it and where? As you look at the universe of medical devices. So I have never spoken in this venue before about anything but a cardiovascular device. I have never spoken about uterine mesh or breast implants. I have never spoken about metal-on-metal hip implants. But that's the world of medical devices. There are many of them, ophthalmic devices, all shapes and sizes. And the only way that we could conceive of how to go forward would be to look around for priority device areas. So you can define that in a number of ways, and we can discuss this if you want to in a little bit. High-risk devices, permanently implantable devices, very expensive devices. There are lots of ways of thinking about it. But also the task force is very clear opportunistically. So devices that already have an established national registry. In coronaries, the ACC's NCDR registry captures more than 90% of the interventional cardiology practices in the United States. That's a heck of a place to start if you want to build an example of a system. And then the key was that these, to go forward, would have to be projects that on one hand had an immediate need that would drive people either passionately or from a funding area to pursue it because there's an immediate device impact, but would be required concomitantly to develop generalizable principles, principles of partnering, principles of data sharing, principles that are generalizable and could be reapplied in other device areas to accelerate the advance of coordinated registry networks in other areas. And that cataloging function was again a priority recommendation for the national system, that as these pilot projects go forward, there's got to be an entity that makes the generalizable, reusable principles of success or failure visible and accessible to anyone who wants to pursue a CRN in a new area to help grow the system. So this is an organic sort of growth structure, but based on building its own momentum by creating successful interoperability solutions or other approaches to using structured data that can be exported from one device area, like in cardiology, to another, like in OBGYN or whatever. That would allow us to go forward with an organic growth system that actually probably wouldn't take billions of dollars of congressional funding to drive. So in summary, the foundation and first steps, which was the spirit of the task force recommendations, this is not a final blueprint. This is more of a way of how do you get going and not waste a decade writing a final blueprint that's going to be out of date by the time you get to 10 years from now. The fundamental objective, again, is to shift from idiosyncratic heterogeneity, where we're spending most of our analytic computational power in figuring out what's noise from what's signal, to true device dimensionality that contains the true heterogeneity of clinical practice in the US in an analytic way, informing us as to where in the dimensionality of actual medical device use we could make things better. And whether it's training doctors or selecting patients, or we really need to build a better generation of devices. The strategic CRN architecture gives us a scalable system. So we can start where there are existing systems, that's starting with a lot of efficiency, minimum re-engineering, and build on that by reusing what we learn along the way. It allows for staged implementation where we can start in the highest priority areas. So where do we really have needs? Where are we already worried that devices are misbehaving? Or where are we already aware that we have devices that are going into millions of human subjects every year where we don't have good safety information, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, in the pilot projects portfolio, use a structure that actually is in the original MD EpiNet Charter and is the fundamental heart and soul of what we originally conceived of as our work project programs, which is disease-specific, device-specific focus, but where there is some sort of generalizable principle that can be utilized in other device areas that's concomitantly illustrated in the pilot. That structure actually goes back to our original grant proposal. And then the reuse of the solutions across device areas as a way of organically building both momentum and consistency as to how we create data sharing, address data security, create shared governance, allow patient information and patient acknowledgement, whether it's by redefining what we consider informed consent or actually reaching out and getting informed consent when the devices go in their clinical procedure, not just for research protocols per se. This preserves flexibility and allows us customization across diversity. So from specific devices as new areas, new innovative areas we're about to enter, for instance, in the United States, the arena of completely absorbable coronary scaffolds. So instead of a metal stent that's in your heart forever, and if you put another one in and another one in and another one in, we have patients with 12, 14, I think the record published is 76 stents in one heart, that we're putting in stents that 2 or 3 years after their implantation are gone. They're tissue again. So what do we really know about, and what are the tools going to be to collect the long-term safety information about these patients? The way we do clinical trials today, there is no good answer to that question. Going forward, we may have some much better answers, and the National Medical System recommendations are designed to enhance that capability. This also means that we can really address individual stakeholder needs. One source of information, called the Clinical Practice of Medicine in the United States, being tapped for multiple different stakeholder purposes, where we all share the same basis of, at some level, I want to know about the safety and the benefit versus the risk of using these devices, in whom, by whom, and compared to what. And ultimately, working together, what we know from the cardiac safety, what we know from other public-private partnerships, what I know from more than 2 decades in this organization, is that when you genuinely promote collaboration, everything gets better. The whole atmosphere of goodwill and trust, second maybe only to alcohol, is a great way to inspire people to creative thinking. So we adopted this African proverb, which was shared in one of our pediatric safety meetings last February, into the introduction of the report. And it reads, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And listed here are the members of the Medical Device Registry Task Force. So going forward, what we thought we'd do is actually, so technically, this is all just going to be our general questions and answers session. We're just going to make it a little longer than usual. And we've had the good fortune of a number of the people who've really been central to everything I've just shared with you, who were able to physically be here with us today. So I'm going to call them up to the table and make them face the fire. And we're going to talk about where does this go. And I think many of you have probably recognized that the Safe PCI for Women clinical trial, which was led by Sunil Rao and again Hussein Al-Khalidi and so many people here at the DCRI, Britt Barham was the lead project leader. This was our first partnering with the ACC NCDR for a registry-based prospective randomized trial. And I'm not going to relive it all other than to recognize that I think it's fair to say this trial was as exciting, including Sunil's presentation as the featured late-breaking clinical trial at TCT 2 years ago, that it drew as much attention for the structure of the efficiency of using information that was already electronically in flow from NCDR sites being entered into the college's quality-oriented registry to auto-populate a Part 11 compliant central database in addition to data gathered directly from the sites, taking away about 2/3 of the site coordinator's work from the index hospitalization and turning it into a direct electronic feed, as well as taking advantage of the quality measures that the NCDR already has in place, as what I think is fair to say is one of the cleanest data sets or fewest queries of a data set that at least I've been involved with in my entire tenure here. And as Mike Lauer, who heads the NHLBI up in Washington, wrote in the New England Journal in conjunction with the report of the TASTE study, and many of you know Stefan James, who was here for several years, who's now one of the leaders of the SCAR registry, the National Cardiology Registry in Sweden, which in this same issue of the journal reported the TASTE study done in a registry-based environment. The impact of this type of registry-based trial efficiency for medical device evaluation at a minimum is profound. The speed of enrollment, the ease of workload at the clinical site level, the reduced cost to manufacturers who want to answer questions about devices is profound. And in fact, even Wall Street recognized this in their comments that followed Mike's editorial in the New England Journal. So we have a number of such opportunities on the plate currently at the DCRI. Some of this is, I'm not going to go into all of the details, but this ranges from IDE extensions with two not terribly competitive manufacturers, Medtronic and Volcano, which is now part of Philips, in the Safe STEMI for Seniors protocol. Biosensors, the ones who I showed you the New York Times article about how Yochi Liu is committed as the CEO to never bringing a product into the United States because of the barriers that the US FDA erected. We now have on the table and have met with the FDA in our first pre-IDE meeting for their first pivotal pre-market device approval trial in a prospective randomized registry-based clinical trial that in fact proposes to link short and long-term follow-up from two different electronic sources. The Absorb USA, Absorb is the first bioabsorbable coronary stent device that will be approved probably at panel very late this year or in the first quarter of next year. And in the post-market, all of the questions we've referred to. How do you really understand the long-term safety and or benefits of a device that disappears from a human coronary is on tap, and Dave Huffner and many others in this, some in this room, have sent as a proposal to Abbott. And the RAPID study looking in the peripheral device interventional world where there are all sorts of gadgets, and as anyone who makes those devices, uses those devices, or any regulator who regulates those devices will happily call the wild, wild west, because we know nothing about how these devices work. Everything uses different definitions. And RAPID is essentially working with Terry Reed's help, who is here in the National Library of Medicine, to create not only structured data, but structured device identifiers as well, to pull through into multiple electronic health record systems There are two major national registries, but neither one of them reach more than about 30% of the practice of medicine in the US. And ultimately, to be able to extract structured data from multiple EHR sources using structured data and bring some order to this particular dimension of the Wild Wild West. And again, this is largely being coordinated with Skylar Jones and Anita here at the DCRI. So there are a lot of challenges in this domain, and we can focus on any of these where you want to take the conversation. Partnering with the NCDR is not simple. There are politics and business parts that all have to be integrated. Partnering with CMS has become easier, but it's not simple because this is really not their mandate. Nobody set up the Center for Medicare Services to be an outcomes database for the United States of America, so a little bit of a gap that has to be filled. EHR manufacturers come in many shapes and sizes and see or don't see this as an important agenda in serving their customers. And in the VA, probably the best single electronic health record system in the country, CART-CL is there, but so is the federal government. So nothing is simple. IT interoperability, partnered business models, and ultimately, we've had a lot of really good people pull together to think about to what degree it's time for a DCRI product line to evolve along the lines of registry-based as a clinical trial product. And I think in the same way that in 1990 and 91, we watched Gusto propel us into the megatrial era, and we figured out how to do megatrials. We're really on the threshold of a very important and potentially signature dimension for the DCRI to deliver to US and global trials, which is registry-based trials, where we, instead of guaranteeing that things will be big, we guarantee that things will be efficient and structured and not built in parallel with the clinical practice of medicine, but taken directly from the clinical practice of medicine. So let me stop there and bring our targeted group, if you will, to the front, and thank you very much. Take that one there. All right, so I'll cheat and let anybody in the front row here who wants to start. Any thoughts, comments?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. I mean, it's a really impressive presentation, Mitch, and I think it tackles something that all of us who work with medical devices have thought about for a long time. I mean, it's hard as an interventional cardiologist or even someone who works in the electrophysiology lab where you're putting in devices in people, and then, in particular for our EP colleagues, for example, all of a sudden there are recalls or patients have to come back in to get their pacemaker leads revised. So anything that makes that process easier to track and faster to translate to the bedside is helpful. I guess one of the things that I've noticed in working on these kinds of issues is that large organizations are very, very adept at monetizing things like this. And so one of the challenges that we've had in the registry-based trials process is that people who own the registries, for example, see it as yet another revenue source. So maybe you could comment a little bit about what the challenges are when you try to make things cheaper. Do you end up taking that amount that you would have saved and just shuffling it to a different line item? And how do we sort of prevent that from happening?
Britt, you have all the answers, right? So one thing I'll remind all of us is, again, just to abuse a word, the dimensionality of real clinical trial costs. The line items is only one dimension. And just to recognize that actually, if we spent the identical amount of money on two trials, but one trial, the enrollment was 30% faster than the other, from a sponsor's point of view, that's market entry that in a large market could not just be hundreds of thousands, but could be many millions of dollars. So I think like everything, as we think about expense and cost, I guess one of the things that I think is critical to our business development side is the ability to make device sponsors in particular see how much they're saving by working with us. And to what degree our product line can convey that as a cost savings. It may be that at the end of the day, the line items, if we can at least keep conscionable partners, so we're not paying excessive amounts, but if the actual clinical trial costs were identical because we have to pay a partner, if the timelines were faster, I think that would still be a very saleable potential business model. But
maybe I'll respond to Sunil's question. As always, Sunil brings up one of the big points and one of the big stumbling blocks that we've run into. So at least in the transcatheter and the surgical device space, just what you're talking about, Sunil. So the way that we addressed it there was transparency. So being very clear with industry where those line items were coming from, and with the FDA where those line items were coming from, and then letting it shake out from there. So I think as long as you're transparent, the market forces eventually drive it back to where the cost ought to be. So that's from my perspective.
I think the other facet is we're interested in developing information about medical devices and medical products in general that's not only for a single country market, but also for a global market. So part of the benefits of the standardization that comes with developing uniform registry-based trials is increased portability of information through different regions of the world. So in terms of both informing global device development and informing global healthcare policy, developing information that can be used several times over, not only in terms of understanding a single device or family of devices, but also in a number of different care environments. That also leverages the amount of resources that you expend to collect these data.
did you have a comment? There are mics above your head, so.
Yeah, so this is more of a business question, and I really appreciate Dr. Rao's comment of the complexities to partner with societies and ownership of data. Executing contracts that involve one society or two is really troublesome. But when you looked at that rapid design, you had 12 sponsors. What did you put into that for legal contract execution time in reality? Are you signed? Is it?
So the style we are taking with RAPID is much more like what we did with the Academic Research Consortium. The deliverable here is a document.
Okay.
It's not a trial.
Okay.
So that sort of downgrades the degree. Now, in Safe STEMI for seniors, on the other hand, we have two different manufacturers, Philips and Medtronic. And this is a DCRI-sponsored IDE, so they have signed up for it. And in Safe PCI for women, I think we had a half a dozen manufacturers.
8 sponsors. I think the Rite Aid shelves of Advil were completely cleaned out during the contract process. But I think the point is a good one, because what we learned in the Safe PCI for Women experience is that the DCRI at the time was set up to have a one sponsor, one code system, not a project code. So it was an interesting eye-opener. I mean, among many things that we learned in the Safe PCI for Women experience was that if you have a multiple sponsored project, accounts have to be open for all of those different sponsors. And the DCRI was great at actually doing this. The adaptability of our financial structure in that particular context was pretty remarkable. And the fact that we got those 8 contracts, 6 of whom were industry sponsors, 2 of which were government. We actually had funding from the FDA Office of Women's Health. Get those contracts executed is a testament to Britt, who was like a dog with a bone on this, but also I think just our own our offices here at DCRI that were really good at doing that. So hopefully, I don't think we'll have, as David said, we hope we don't have to keep reinventing that wheel.
Are you saying 6 months? You were able to execute that in 6 months, or longer, shorter?
Do you remember how long it was?
It was a different time frame depending on which sponsor, and
Right.
different sponsors were approached to different starting points as far as the project was concerned. To answer, I think, another part of your question, lessons learned and feedback. Our legal team, Mike Redden was the point on a lot of the negotiations with the legal language with these contracts, and he did pay attention, if you will, to the lessons learned and the ways to make the contracts more smooth next go round. And a testament to his work and diligence on that, we did forward our template multi-sponsor or multi-funding source agreement to Phillips Volcano about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And upon first look, they said, looks pretty good. No huge deal breakers. We don't see anything major that we would push back on at this point.
Right. We have 10 companies coming next Tuesday for a multi-funded project, so that's great news.
So the other piece that's financial transparency and contracting as challenges. The other piece that we've seen, or that I've interacted especially recently, is industry expectations. And so as a sponsor who's now used to Gusto, who's used to the mega trials that we put out so well, how do we get them to shift their expectations? So we have confidence intervals down to nothing. We have error down to nothing, and that's a science. And how do we get them to sort of broaden their horizons to accept different sources of data? For example, there's some risk that comes along with that, and is the financial piece enough, or that's the leveraging at the industry, the FDA, the regulatory bodies, et cetera. But I think the industry expectations, I think, are the next piece. They see the dollar sign and say, terrific, but is our company ready with this product to go to that level?
So I'd like to address the product piece, which is, Mitch, you said something about disruptive as a term used for these registry-based trials. And it's actually been disruptive internally in a sense, which is good because it's made us think of how we do work. As we started to get the registry-based trial team together, start talking about this, we have to break through a lot of barriers internally just to think about who's responsible. Is it outcomes? Is it going to be the trials group? Do we do safety traditionally, or are we actually going to do all the follow-up through CMS? Well, we can't follow up some patients through CMS because they're not in CMS. I think the other piece that strikes me, and it comes down to money in the conversation as well, when we did the Abbott bid, we did it essentially, I think, through a traditional thought process initially. And we came up with a budget that was, over $22 million initially. And, the first thought from Matt via email was, this will not fly. And the reality was, it's true. We thought about it a lot differently. We had a lot of different people work on the budget. Actually, Beth Frallo from Outcomes did a great job of kind of guiding us in the right direction. We came up with a budget range from $14 million all the way down to $3 million. Well, the sponsor sees $3 million and says, that's the study I want. In reality, that might not be the study they can actually do based on what they agree with the agency on. But, we gave them assorted options that they could look at and hopefully fit within what they need to do. And I think it always strikes me, too, that these medical device companies are not GSK, they're not Pfizer, they're not walking around with billions of dollars sitting around. Even though Abbott's huge, they're still very cost conscious, and it's the world we live in, the medical device side, which is very striking.
Yeah, I mean, Abbott's P&L's just emerging. They laid off a very large number of people. So I think the environment that we're working in, certainly with medical device companies, Biosensors is a very small, cost-sensitive company. This is not the mega trial universe for sure. David?
Yeah, I think the other concern that companies have with things that are different from the traditional mold is to what extent will a given clinical investigation accomplish their regulatory objectives, which usually involve approval of some new medical product into commercial distribution in the United States. And so I think that's one of the reasons that our relationship with FDA and our continuing dialogue with regulators in FDA and CMS as a continuous process is an incredible leverage on top of what we do in this building. So again, a lot of it has to do with building relationships and collaboratively developing research designs and research plans that are different from the traditional applications that are submitted to regulatory approval, but are things that, from a regulatory standpoint, the regulators recognize are necessary to create efficiencies to make the U.S. a site where people no longer do LIM trials, last in man, and to move us a little bit further forward in terms of the global distribution and development of new technology.
I would certainly agree and even amp. I mean, we've been doing this a long time. We have a lot of folks at the FDA who intellectually not only get this, but are actively promoting it. And to bring a sponsor in who've heard from us enough to make this sound like a good idea and sit down face to face with the FDA and have the FDA actually not only be enthusiastic but creative along these lines is priceless in its own right in terms of risk mitigation going forward. Chris?
So a couple of comments, Mitch. First of all, thanks for doing this. It's terrific. And for all of you guys being here, I think it's exactly the kind of thing that DCRI should be involved with. I would suggest it's not so different for drugs. Most of the issues are almost identical for how drugs are used in general practice and with different adherence and different populations. And we have the example of the novel oral anticoagulants where the FDA has been very involved in these comparative effectiveness studies, which frankly, Carrie Lee has taught me that the statement that you made about kind of having structured data, having less of an issue with noise when you're doing observational analyses is actually something we need to be extraordinarily careful about, because it may just provide us with a more precise estimate of a fundamentally confounded observation, which will end up hurting patients, like we see, for example, with treating sleep apnea and heart failure, central sleep apnea and heart failure. All the studies, observational studies, suggest that it should be terrific, and you do a randomized trial, and you're killing people. So we need to, but I think you're saying the same thing, that fundamentally the randomization is still critical to come up with a estimate of modest treatment effects when we're looking at things. The final comment that I'd ask you to maybe to reflect on is, it seems as though, and I think this is happening, the US is so unbelievably complicated that these demonstration projects that you talk about, I think sometimes are better done in collaboration with our colleagues in these countries who are so much smaller, with a single healthcare system and more organized. You know, like TASTE, for example, and a lot of, like this trial done in Scotland with non-steroidals, where they just randomize people in the doctor's office and then just use public records to collect information on cardiovascular safety of celecoxib and non-steroid, things like that. I wonder if it's almost too much to try to do like national programs in the U.S. at this stage in some of this work.
So let me just capture two of those, because that's really, you made just a series of terrific points, Chris. And there's no free lunch. There are no simple answers, but let me be really clear, because this is so important. A lot of the discussion about registries makes people feel like we're talking about observational data and somehow disconnecting randomization. And that's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about registry-based infrastructure. And like the Safe PCI for Women, this is a prospective randomized trial. It's just that the registry gives us about 75% of the data that we need to collect because it's already in a continuous flow. And an electronic health record option might do the same. So the use of the word registry, and even for the Medical Device Registry Task Force, or for the recommendations for a national device system using coordinated registry networks, is not a step away from randomization. It's just about 30 pages of case report forms we don't have to rebuild every single time we do a randomized trial. So prospective, appropriate statistical designs to make sure that we're creating appropriate information sources doesn't go away. In fact, it is just facilitated. So registry does not imply non-randomized observational data only. It's an infrastructure step that helps deploy structured data. And I forgot the second one, so maybe, Carrie. Yeah. Sorry, Carrie?
I'd just like to follow up your point there, and again, this has been really great, Mitch, but what is your experience to date with respect to the quality of the data, which is another important dimension here? If we can reduce the cost of clinical trials, if we can maintain randomization, and also preserve the quality of the information that's collected and reported and used for purposes of approving devices or drugs, then that's a real win-win situation. But can you comment on data quality in this context?
So I think data quality is as close to religion as we get, so let's dive in. I think on the one hand, it's fair to say, certainly for certain sources like the NCDR from Bill Weintraub's first launch to where it is today, has evolved many of its own quality control systems, which have greatly improved the quality of those data. But it's still pretty much site-based data, and there are, again, plenty of opportunities to put monitoring of data quality into place where it's appropriate to do so. What I am proudest of, and what Matt and again a number of folks here have driven, is creating at least validity assessments. So, for instance, with claims data, death, rehospitalization, I mean, you can find codes for most of the endpoints that we would typically use, but for some, like myocardial infarction, what a site calls an MI so they can bill for it, and what an independent adjudication body would call a rules-based definition of an MI, as Matt's shown, are not a one-to-one match. So to what degree that's really invalid, I had a very interesting discussion in claims terms with Rosemary Hakim. Validity is really about fraud. You know, they're not adjudicating enzyme levels, they just want to know if they're paying for service, that it was actually performed. But validity ultimately relative to what more expensive clinical trials mechanisms would generate, and then the ability to add those mechanisms if needed. So add monitoring, add adjudication, the efficiency of the data accrual up front may still remain. So not a black and white answer, a very important area, and I think doing validity assessments is going to continue to be important. Interestingly, some of us, David and Allison Handler and I were just in Japan and met with the CEO and president of the PMDA, which is the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare's medical research regulatory front end. And we were talking about, in fact, this December, we'll do a meeting over there in Yokohama focused on many of these same issues, because they were just the leading body of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum and working on this work item. And we talked about how in the US adding claims data, billing data, had been used in the TVT registry, and in Japan, of course, it's not just for Medicare eligible 65 years and older. In Japan, the government pays for everybody. So they have billing data for everybody. And he very kindly said, well, but you have to recognize that in Japan, doctors use billing codes that make them more money. So you have to be careful. And we smiled and said, yeah, I think doctors in the United States do the same thing. So the degree to which we shift these mechanisms and the quality of information as we capture it, I think, is on all of our minds. But I think the validity of outcomes that we have seen, and certainly for big endpoints, death, MI, in fact, just from an ascertainment point of view, loss to follow-up in a typical clinical trial is a fairly modest range around the site that enrolls the patient. Loss to follow-up in claims data, unless you move out of the country, if you actually have somebody's social security number with their permission to link to their claims data, improves. So quality comes in many areas, and I think paying attention to all of them is why I think that this approach emerging from this organization has more chance to have the right kind of impact on the national device architecture that we have than anywhere else, and I'm very proud to be here, so thank you.
Maybe one last comment, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, one last comment?
I was just going to say, based on that, would a looser definition of, for instance, MI, rather than a more defined definition, because we need to know exactly what's happening, would that not be a better mechanism, although perhaps now maybe we have a larger variability in what we're talking? I mean,
Sure, and again, I think, like the whole end of this conversation, the right answer is usually not in the extremes, it's in the middle. So if we broaden by coding to all coded MIs, the likelihood is we might change the relationship, for instance, of how predictive is an MI of death over the next 5 years if we're using claims data than, say, we would get from a rigorous clinical trial design. As long as we understand the frame shift, then again, what's the validity of the information really depends on what we're trying to apply it to evaluate.
And I think what we've seen in a couple of examples now, both in our own work linked to claims, so in-house clinical trials linked to claims, as well as the WHI data, the Women's Health Initiative data linked to claims, both have shown that when your definition changes, your event rates change. But neither has shown a difference in either your point estimate or your confidence intervals. So it seems to be distributed across the two treatment groups. So your event rates are changing, but your point estimate and your confidence intervals are staying roughly the same. So at least so far.
And then would it be the same in Japan as it is in the US? Start, Control, Delete, let's ask that question. And fortunately, through these types of collaborative efforts, we might even be able to answer that question.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks and congrats on this wonderful work. Really appreciate kicking off the year with this fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Great to see you. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. I don't see you.